It's this time of the year again when I look back at how I spent my time watching movies, TV shows, and playing video games instead of working on that thesis for my master's degree. But hey, we all need a break now and then, and this is when we watch films to get away from all the nonsense and enjoy some good old escapist fiction. Today, I'd like to tell you about my top 5 films I watched this year. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that the film came out in 2021, I just happened to watch it for the first time this year. Mind you, this is only a short list, and I will put some honorable mentions at the end. But it's enough introduction, let's get on with it. I started the year with my usual Oscar movies binge watch because I make it my goal to watch all the movies nominated for Best Picture before the Academy Awards, so I can feel like I have a right to complain if a movie I didn't like won something. And I have to admit that the nominees for this year were all surprisingly good. Normally, there's always at least one movie where I have trouble understanding why it's nominated for Best Picture or why so many people were hyped about the movie. But this year, I actually enjoyed every nominee, even if there were some I preferred over others. But there wasn't any film that I outright disliked. Now, it was difficult to choose my highlight from those Best Picture nominees, and in the end, I simply decided to go with the only one which I have, since the Academy Awards, rewatched several times. So my first movie highlight of 2021 was The Trial of the Chicago 7. If you've watched any of my Doctor Who reviews, you know I'm a sucker for a good historical story. I just love learning about people and events in past days that I've never heard of before, and this movie introduced me to an event that straight up fascinated me right away, and I just couldn't let go of it. Now, the movie was written and directed by Aaron Sorkin, and his script made this movie bloody fantastic. When I looked up if I had seen any of his other movies and discovered that he was the writer for The Social Network and Steve Jobs, it became clear to me why the movie's dialogue and presentation flow so well as they do. The Trial of the Chicago 7 tells the story of a group of anti-Vietnam War protesters who were charged with conspiracy and crossing state lines with the intention of inciting riots at the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago. The movie is basically one half court drama and one half personal stories as we see how the events of the protest actually unfolded. I had never heard of this trial before, and when I watched the film and saw how absolutely ridiculously and unfairly the people were treated, and that the prosecution was clearly out to make this a political trial, I thought the judge had to be an exaggeration, but looking into some of the actual events and reading about the real life events made it clear to me that this really was one of the most absurd and unjust trials of all time. Now, of course, I understand that the events as they are depicted in the film aren't 100% historically accurate, but I think the story does what a movie based on real life events is supposed to do. It gets you interested in the actual event and makes you think about what happened in the past. It was fascinating to see how many different kinds of people came together to protest, and then once they are at court, you have to watch this same mismatched group manage their defense, and of course, they all go about it differently at first and don't really get along. It's interesting to see that there are good and bad sides to all of those characters. The disrespectful yippies actually have some intelligent remarks to make. The educated student isn't as rational as he likes to think, and the Attorney General, who you thought was going to be a pain in the butt, actually wants to help out. This film feels like you're watching a play. There aren't many different locations, and the dialogue and reactions of the characters are at the forefront. This was a wonderfully engaging movie to watch, and I can definitely recommend to anyone who enjoys a great script and a fascinating story. If you have watched this channel for a while, you know that I like comic books and that I'm especially a fan of anything DC related. There's actually going to be a theme for this list. There were some really good comic book movies this year, but of course, the one which became an immediate highlight has to be Zack Snyder's Justice League. Now, to be honest, I never had that big of a problem with the original Justice League movie. Sure, it wasn't great, but to me it wasn't as terrible as everyone else had made it out to be. In retrospect, I'd probably think about the original movie differently, but hey. But now this was a movie. It wasn't only a movie, it was an experience. Like, when do you ever sit down for over 4 hours and actually don't get bored for a minute? Zack Snyder's vision of Justice League is an art piece. You honestly can't say it in a different way. Even if you don't like the film, you have to admit it was a huge undertaking and that you can tell how much effort, love, and sweat went into the making of this film. This is vastly different compared to the movie we got back in 2017. The characterization for each member of the Justice League is greatly improved in Snyder's version. Especially Cyborg finally gets the attention he needs and the development he deserves. It was fantastic to see him struggle through his very existence, how he had come to terms with what his father had done, and if he could ever really reconnect with him and forgive him. Cyborg's appearance finally made sense. I understood why he was a member of the Justice League. I understood why he was in the narrative, and it was so much fun to see how he interacted with everyone else. Ben Affleck is still my favourite live action Batman to this date, and this movie just proves it as it shows you how Bruce brings together the members of the Justice League and tries to be their leader while at the same time having to rely on them to help him when needed. The return of Superman was handled so much better in this version, and it didn't just feel tagged on so that we could, just have Superman in the movie. Seeing Clark Kent in that black suit resurrected from the dead was bloody brilliant. And unlike that, he doesn't overshadow the other members of the Justice League. He doesn't take immediate command, he doesn't immediately fix the whole situation. No, it takes every single member of the Justice League to defeat Steppenwolf. Speaking of which, the villain is so much better in this film. Not only have his looks improved, but through the inclusion of Darkseid, it gave context to his actions, and it's so much more terrifying to know that Steppenwolf is only a precursor to the chaos that Darkseid will bring in the future. And speaking of newly introduced characters, Martian Manhunter is in this as well, which I did not expect at all to happen. There was so much cool stuff going on in this film, and yes, maybe a bit too much stuff, and yes, maybe the film is a tad too long with 4 hours, but personally I have to say I wasn't bored once watching this. Zack Snyder's cinematography is absolutely gorgeous. Every shot looks beautiful, and I'm just a fan of the darker, grittier tone his DC movies have, and I think it all came together wonderfully in this version of Justice League. Let's stay with comic book movies, and let's stay with DC in fact, because every year there has to be one animated movie highlight, and this year it was Batman The Long Halloween. Now, I haven't read the comic book this story is based on, and I know, shame on me, don't worry, I plan on reading it soon. And yes, I know that these are strictly speaking two movies, but come on, they basically function as one since they tell one coherent story and one doesn't work without the other. This this is just a great comic book story. It has thrill, drama, detective work, murder, action. It's everything you could want from an interesting Batman story. It has some interesting theming with the murders being committed around holidays, while at the same time you have the struggles of the Falcone family and the mental breakdown of Harvey Dent going on at the same time. Even the Joker turns up at some point, which I did not expect to happen, and this story actually manages to make you interested in a villain called Calendar Man. Like, when does that ever happen? Surprisingly enough, the whole story surrounding the Falcone family was the most interesting part, especially once you realize how this family of gangsters is actually connected to Bruce Wayne's past. This man who fights crime and would normally send the Falcones to prison, he now has to protect and help them, and then it turns out he actually has a childhood memory of the Falcone family. And Bruce isn't the only one who's connected to the gangster family. Every single character in the story ties back to the Falcones and the murders committed against them. And some of those reveals I honestly did not see coming. While I think you can take a good guess as to who turns out to be the mastermind behind all of it, the story still manages to keep you on your toes at all times. There's always something that makes you second guess yourself. Characters take an unexpected development, people die out of nowhere, some popular Batman villain turns up and makes everything even crazier. There's a lot of stuff going on in this one story, but at the end of the day, it's a thrilling crime drama featuring unusual characters, but they only help to make the story one worth remembering. Just like last year, I have to talk about my horror movie highlight this year. So this Halloween, my friend and I did a good old-fashioned horror binge, and among that was the Netflix movie The Ritual. And unlike the movie Creep, which was my horror highlight last year, this film didn't outright frighten me, but it did what I like the most about good horror. It created a chilling atmosphere. The movie is about a group of four friends who, in order to honor the wish of their late friend, go on a hiking trip in Sweden. The group has been shaken by the death of their friend, which occurred while one of the group members was hiding instead of helping. So there's a lot of tension going all around, and then things get even worse when, during their trip, one of them hurts their leg badly, and they can't continue the hike. They decide to take a shortcut through the forest, and we all know that going into a forest in a horror movie is never a good idea. Soon enough, the group experiences weird hallucinations, nightmares, and one by one the members of the group are taken over by whatever the hell the horror in the woods is. I just love the whole vibe of this movie. Again, it's not necessarily a film that frightens you. If you're used to horror, this won't scare you, but it'll give you a classic horror story with some really good spooky vibes. The setting of the Swedish forest is perfect because the shots through the trees make the woods look endless, and when you catch a glimpse of the horror within the forest, it looks pretty spooky and creates a wonderfully chilling image. The first half of the movie is mostly focused on the group dynamics as we see how each of the friends are and how they cope with the death of their friend and how they eventually try to handle the strange events that are going on in the forest. The second half of the movie is more focused on exploring the horror and shows you what the origins of the spooky events are while testing the relationships of the four friends. The main character of the group is the one guy who was there when the friend was murdered, and he's plagued by feelings of guilt and anger since he decided to hide instead of helping his friend. While the characters aren't exactly like fleshed out or super detailed, I think the main character has some good emotional and psychological struggle going on, which carries him through the movie, and it helps that he has a bit of a rivalry with one of the other friends in the group who blames him for the death of their friend. So not only do you have horror and emotional trauma, but you also get some friendship drama which goes through a noticeable development. And for a horror movie which really isn't focused that much on character development, the story still manages to at least make its main protagonist interesting. It's honestly a little hard for me to explain why I enjoyed the movie as much as I did, because it kind of boils down to I like the spooky Canadian vibes and I'm a fan of the general atmosphere. Because I don't necessarily need to get frightened by a horror movie, I like spooky films that are simply able to create an interesting and eerie atmosphere. And that's what The Ritual does, which is why it's my horror movie highlight of 2021. And last but by no means least, we come back once more to DC Comics, and of course, I have to talk about The Suicide Squad. Now, I've actually done a review of this film back when it came out, so I'm not going to say too much here, and you can go and watch that video if you want to know more. But this movie was just so much fun to watch. While I didn't have too big of a problem with the first Suicide Squad film, this one was miles better and so much more enjoyable. James Gunn really hit it out of the park with this one, which honestly kind of surprised me because while I did enjoy Guardians of the Galaxies, those films didn't really excite me that much. So I was happy to see that James Gunn's style of filmmaking comedy worked brilliantly in this movie. The film has such a brilliant aesthetic style and cinematography. It really feels like you're watching a comic book movie in all the good ways. It's ridiculous and over the top in all the right places, and it never takes itself too seriously. At the same time, it manages to tell not only a fun but also somewhat emotional story of these villainous characters who all got more going on than meets the eye. I also like that the movie doesn't ignore its predecessor and isn't afraid to make fun of its premise and the similarities between the first and the second movie. Yes, Bloodsport is very similar to the Deadshot character, but then they just say that Peacemaker basically also does the same thing, but we would all agree that they are still three distinct characters. This film really takes the concept of villains being thrown together to go on a deadly mission and they just roll with it. People are dying left and right, and the film just doesn't care because theoretically everyone is expendable. The film manages to introduce a handful of new characters and makes them interesting, funny, and distinct, and we all, in one way or another, care for them, even though they are villains. But the movie also takes characters from the previous film, like Harley Quinn and Rick Flag, and manages to greatly improve on them. Especially Rick Flag benefits from this sequel, turning him into a guy who isn't only a badass, but actually a bit of a goofball at times. But he has really come into his own as a leader and even formed a friendship with some of the members of the squad. His friendship with Harley Quinn is especially noteworthy, since you wouldn't expect the two of them to get along as well as they do. Harley gets to be on her own little adventure in this movie, which shows her growth as a character, which we saw in Birds of Prey. But luckily, the old characters don't overshow the new ones, who have brilliant chemistry, whether it be friendship or rivalry. And don't get me wrong, some of these characters are absolutely ridiculous, but somehow this film was able to make the bloody polka dot man interesting. But this is exactly what I love about this film. It's exactly the right kind of ridiculous. It doesn't take itself too seriously, but it takes itself serious enough to make you care about the story and the characters. And that's why Suicide Squad was one more highlight this year. And as promised, there are going to be a few honorable mentions, which serve just as much as a recommendation as the top 5 I spoke about. First honorable mention is another of the Oscar nominees, namely Sound of Metal. The movie is about a heavy metal drummer who loses his hearing and joins a shelter for deaf recovering addicts. This movie hit me on a personal level. While I have no idea what it's like to be deaf, nor do I know anyone who's hard of hearing, I've very much made an experience that's kind of similar to what happens to the main character in this film. When you fall ill and don't want to accept what's happening to you, and you get sent to a hospital where you have a hard time adjusting and don't even fully understand what's going on, and all you want is to get better, but it's not going to be that easy. I really connected with the main character of that story, and if it wasn't for Anthony Hopkins being a bloody legend, I would have loved to see Riz Ahmed win the Oscar for Best Actor. And the second honorable mention is a South Korean film called New World. It's a 2013 crime drama by Park Hon-chung. I came across it because Lee Chung-chae, the actor who plays Gyu in Squid Game, plays the lead role in this movie, and I wanted to see what else he's done. New World is about a man who is an undercover police officer working in South Korea's largest corporate crime syndicate. He's been working for them for years, and the promise of reassignment is drawing closer, but then the chairman of the syndicate dies, and a fight for the succession breaks out. The cop is forced to stay undercover for a longer time, ensuring that the right people rise to the top of the syndicate, so it'll be easier for the police to bust the gang. While the movie is as long with 130 minutes, it's a cool and thrilling gangster drama with all the action high stakes you could wish for. It ends exactly as you want it to end, and it feels so badass. The acting is fantastic across the board, there is brutality, there's drama and risk, and it's simply a good crime drama. So, if you are ever in need of a good non-English thriller, go and watch New World. And that's it for my top 5 movies I watched in 2021. Thank you so much for watching, and please do tell me down in the comments below what some of your movie highlights were this year, or if you have any opinions on the movies I told you about, put them down in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.